Okay, so in the last few videos, we've looked at lots of relational expressions and different ways of doing some logic, but we haven't actually seen how to use those things in some code. So in this next series of videos, we're going to talk about some control structures that you may have heard about in other programming classes. And control statements, control structures, are things that change the order of execution of our code. So we know in general code executes one line at a time. It goes from top to bottom. Okay? But sometimes we need to change the order of that code. Maybe we want to skip some lines of code, or maybe want to have a choice between two different lines of code or multiple different lines of code, or sometimes we want some code to repeat itself. And we do that using control statements. We're going to look at if statements, which causes some conditional execution. A condition has to be true. And then we're going to look at loops, which also rely on some kind of condition. If a condition is true, we'll repeat some code. If it's false, we won't repeat some code. So we're going to start out in this video looking at the if statement. So the if statement here in its general form, and this can look a little confusing, but let's ignore for a second everything past the first line. So in the simplest form, an if is followed by a set of parentheses. And inside those parentheses, we have some condition. We have some kind of relational statement that has to be true or false. And that's what we talked about in the previous videos. All these relational operators and things that we can evaluate to a condition of true or false, a Boolean value. Okay. So we put one of those expressions inside the parentheses. If that condition is true, inside some curly braces, we can have a sequence of statements that will execute. If that condition would test to false, the statements inside that next block that within the curly braces will not execute. Okay. And then optionally, we can do if statement or else statements that will execute. If the condition's true, the else statements, let's look at this one down here, will not execute. But if the condition is false, the else statements would execute. And we'll look at some examples of that right here. So let's take this generic version and actually do a real version down here. Not using all the parts, but we're going to use two of the parts. We're going to use the if clause up here, and we're going to use this else clause. So we have if, and then inside the parentheses, we have a condition. So we're testing, is the age greater than or equal to 18? And if the age is greater than or equal to 18, we're going to do the things that are inside the set of curly braces. There's a curly brace, and here's the end of the curly brace. So if the age is greater than 18, if that is true, it's going to pop up an alert that says you may vote. Okay. If that's not true, it's going to come down and say else. I always like to think of else as otherwise. If this is true, I'm going to do this. Otherwise, I'm going to do this. So the else block is what happens if this condition is not true. It will do the else block. So it's the word else followed by another set of curly braces, and all the statements inside those curly braces will execute. So if I'm 19 years old, age is greater than 18, 19 is greater than 18, that would be true. It pops up, you may vote. If I'm 16 years old, if 16 is greater than or equal to 18, that is not true. So it'll pop down and do the else and pop up the alert that says you are not old enough to vote. So that's how an if statement works. Here's one that has multiple conditions. So I talked about if back here, and I talked about else, but I didn't talk about this chain we can have in here of else ifs. Okay. So we can check multiple conditions. We check the first one, then we check the second one, then the third one, fourth one, fifth one. And then ultimately, if none of those are true, the else statement will execute. So here's an example of that. If the rate is not a number, let's pop up an alert box that said you did not provide a number for the rate. But if that's not true, then we'll test this. So otherwise, if the rate is less than 0, I want a pop-up alert that says the rate may not be less than 0. But if that's not true, I'm going to do another test so that I have another else if. Then I'm going to check to see if the rate is greater than 12. Okay? And if the rate's greater than 12, I'm going to pop up an alert that says the rate can't be greater than 12. And if none of these things have tested true, the final thing, the else statement, will execute that says the rate is, and print out the rate. All right. So it's a string of conditional tests. We keep going down the string testing until we find one that's true. The minute I find one that's true, so let's assume that the rate is -5. Okay. Is the rate not a number? The rate is a number. It's fine. So this isn't going to execute. It's going to do this test. -5 is less than 0. That is true. This line of code within this block of curly braces, the rate may not be less than 0 will execute. Nothing else in the chain will be tested and nothing else will execute. So the block of code that follows the first true statement executes, and then everything else gets skipped. If none of these tests true, the else statement will always run. And that'll end that block of code. So what they're doing right here is some input validation. We probably had some kind of form that required the user to put in the interest rate for their loan or something like that. And we're going through testing. Did they actually put in a number for the rate? Did they put in a positive number? If they didn't, we're giving them an error message. Is the rate greater than 12? If it is, we're giving them an error message. So we're testing for all these errors that a user might have had, and that's called input validation. Here's one using a compound conditional expression, meaning we're using one of those conjunctions. We're using the OR operator, the conditional operator. So we have two conditions. So up here we tested 1, 2, 3 different conditions. This one we're doing 2 different conditions, but this time we're using an operator. And this one says if the user entry is not a number, or if the user entry is less than 0, which is really 2 of the expressions we checked here for rate, right? If either of these are true, then we're popping up an error message, and the same thing is happening here. If either of these is true, if this one is true or this one is true, we're popping up an alert that says enter a valid number greater than 0. Which one is better? That becomes the question. If you can combine them into one statement and still have a very good statement telling the person what to fix, then it's okay. If you look back here, this is much more granular. For each of the possible things the user did wrong, we have a very specific method telling them what to fix. This one isn't quite as specific. It doesn't tell them whether the number was negative or whether the number was not even a number. It just says enter a valid number greater than 0. So it's a little more generic error, but it's a much shorter line of code too. It just depends on the specificity that we need. Which method do you use? Do you use a string of ifs and else ifs, or do you use some compound conditional expressions? Also, we can put things like Boolean variables inside our condition. So here's an if statement. If is valid equal true. We're testing to see if this is valid, which is a Boolean variable. Remember I said is almost always indicates that the variable is a Boolean of some kind. So is it true? So we're testing if this true or false variable is equal to true or not. But here's the thing. We don't need to do this comparison because a Boolean variable is already true or false. So we don't need to compare it to true or false. We can say the same thing by just putting if is valid. Okay. Because is valid is already a true or false variable, If it's true, the block of code in the braces will execute. If it's false, the block of code in the braces will be skipped. So we don't have to put, when we have a Boolean variable, we don't have to compare it to true or false. If we're trying to do it with false, so we're testing if is valid is false, we want to do some stuff in this code block here. We could reverse that logic by putting a not in front and then changing this to true. But in general, we can skip both of these methods because they're longer than they need to be. And we can say if is valid not. So if it's not valid, we don't have to use the comparison with something that's already a true or false. If we want to test to see if it's true, we just put it inside the parentheses. If we want to see if it's false, we put it inside the parentheses with a not symbol. I often call this a newbie indicator. I can tell how long a person's been coding. Brand new coders very often will default to putting something like this instead of leaving off the equal true part. It's just something you're thinking about it that way, and you're being more specific than you need to be. This is the shorter, easier to read way to do it. So try not to look like a noob. Try to do this instead of that. This is perfectly valid and it works, but it's more verbose and makes longer code. This is shorter and easier to read. So try to do it that way. All right, in the next upcoming videos, we'll start talking about some control statements that allow us to repeat code.